we have with us Professor Allan Lichtman today. This is the third time that he has joined us to talk about different issues. The first one was on voting rights. The second time he talked about the Second Amendment in the Arlington Central Library, overseen by the Arlington Police, I might add. Both of those generated very spirited discussions. He always brings a lot of energy to his talks. He's a very prolific writer. In addition to hundreds of scholarly articles, he has authored 13 books. The latest is 13 Cracks Repairing American Democracy After Trump. I think that's something definitely going to read. Sounds very interesting. And so not only has he chronicled history, but he's also made history. He has provided testimony in hundreds of civil rights court cases. And today he's here to discuss his 13 keys to the White House. This is about a model that he's developed predicting the presidential election. It has a perfect record beginning with the 1984 election. And I don't know what's with 13, Alan. You seem to be, maybe that's your lucky number. It's coming up here a lot. But anyway, with that as a background, I'll let Alan explain how he came up with the model and maybe some insight into where things stand at the present time. So Professor Lichtman, take it away.
Thank you very much. Welcome all. I will speak for a little while and then I'll take your questions. You can ask me anything you want about U.S. history, current American politics. Don't ask me questions about the opera and we'll get along just fine. Now, I'm sure all of you, every single one of you, has read, seen, and heard things about American presidential elections. I want you to take all of that, everything you've heard from the pundits, the consultants, the ad men, the handlers, take all that and do to it what the great British philosopher David Hume once said you should do to works of superstition: consign them to the flames. Because all that stuff that the media spends hundreds of millions of dollars on covering elections, not only is wrong, but will mislead you, send you down the primrose path to error. You know, I'm not a very sardonic person, but I have to tell you, I took a little bit of sardonic pleasure on election night 2016, watching all the pundits twist themselves into pretzels, trying to explain away why something happened that they all assured us could not possibly happen. And that's all punditry is good for, telling you after the fact what now they think should have happened. The fallacy of punditry and the polls is that they are not backed up by any theory of how American presidential elections really work. They're like sports talk radio, a lot of fun to listen to, but their comments have absolutely no predictive value whatsoever. Because the media has to cover campaigns and elections every single day, they have to adopt the false horse race theory of elections, that elections turn on the twists and turns of the campaign trail, the debates, the speeches, the tricks, the fundraising, the ads, with candidates sprinting ahead and falling behind according to the day-to-day activity of the campaign. Nothing could be more misleading. This view misses the fundamentals of presidential elections, which I have sought to represent through my model, the 13 keys to the White House. The 13 keys to the White House are based upon the proposition that all that stuff that's the grist for the punditry mills count for little or nothing in presidential elections. Rather, presidential elections turn on the strength and performance of the party holding the White House. I call it my Joe the Plumber theory. Joe the Plumber was the guy who asked all those obnoxious questions to Barack Obama. way back when. Well, imagine you hired Joe the plumber to fix your pipes and he flooded your basement. You're not going to hire Joe the plumber again. But if Joe the plumber fixed your pipes, no further damage, charge you a reasonable price, you'd be willing to hire Joe the plumber again. Same thing with a party holding the White House. If they do a good job of governing the country, then the American people aren't fooled by what happens on the campaign trail. They're willing to give that administration another 4 years. But if they mess up and govern poorly and make a lot of mistakes, then the American public, all of you who are so smart, are going to turn to the challenging party. And my system, based upon this proposition, has correctly predicted the last 10 presidential elections, including when I predicted Donald Trump's win in 2016, which you can imagine did not make me very popular in 90% plus Democratic Washington, D.C., where I teach at American University. But, you know, I can't go with my own preferences. I've got to follow the model and the facts where they lead. And I did get this very interesting note on the Washington Post article where I predicted Trump's win. Congrats, Professor, good call, and signed in big Sharpie letters, Donald J. Trump. I was only one of two academic forecasters who correctly predicted Trump's win in 2016. But the other forecaster, who will go nameless, crashed and burned when he predicted a Trump landslide in 2020 with some 360 electoral college votes, only off by more than 150 or so. So I'm the only academic forecaster to have correctly predicted both 2016 and 2020, and elections going all the way back to 1984. Now, I'd love to tell you that I came up with this model by ruining my eyes in the archives, by deep and long, brilliant contemplation. But if I were to tell you that, to quote the late, not so great Richard Nixon, that would be wrong. Like many discoveries, the keys to the White House happened by serendipity, by accident. In 1980-81, I was a visiting distinguished scholar at Caltech, the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena, where all those physicists and astronomers and chemists and mathematicians hang out. Well, being a humble historian, I could walk the campus the entire day and not understand a word of what anyone was saying. But at the dinner honoring the visiting fellows, they put me next to kind of the other oddball visitor. His name was Volodya Kailis Borak, the world's leading authority in earthquake prediction, the head of the Institute of Pattern Recognition and Earthquake Prediction in Moscow. And of course, when two academics get together, what do they tell each other? They ask each other, what do you do? And I explained, I'm a quantitative historian. I look mathematically at trends and patterns in the past up to the present, things like presidential election results. And Volodya turns to me and says, I do same thing. And I said, no, you don't. You're a geophysicist. You don't do anything like what an historian does. And he says, oh, no, I do same thing. You look mathematically at patterns in the social political world. I look mathematically at patterns in the physical world. And that's how I'm able to come up with earthquake predictions. And I said, that's nice. Nice to meet you. Goodbye. And he says, wait. And I said, why? And he said, you and I are going to collaborate. And again, being brilliant and foresightful, I said, no, we're not. Earthquakes may be a big deal here in Southern California. Caltech is right next to LA. But I got to go back to Washington, D.C., American University. Nobody cares about earthquakes there. And he says, oh no, I don't want to collaborate on earthquakes. I've already solved that. Right. He said, get this. In 1963, he was part of the Soviet delegation that came to Washington, D.C. in the Kennedy administration and negotiated the most important treaty in the history of the world. It's the treaty that explains why we're still here. It was the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty that stopped these horrific nuclear tests in the atmosphere and the ocean, stopped us from poisoning our earth and our waters. And he said, while in Washington, I fell in love with politics. And I always wanted to use the methods of earthquake prediction to predict elections. But he said, look, I live in the Soviet Union. Elections, forget it. It's supreme leader or off with your head. And we're seeing a lot of the same thing in Russia today. He said, but you're an expert in the most important elections, American presidential elections. At this point, I thought maybe the guy was a little nuts. Maybe he was KGB back when there was a KGB. Look, I'm an historian. I write about dead people. I have nothing to lose. So we were going to collaborate and use the methods of earthquake prediction to predict American presidential elections. And to do this, remember, this is 1981. We fundamentally recast presidential elections, not as Jimmy Carter versus Ronald Reagan, not as Republicans versus Democrats, not as liberals versus conservatives, but in earthquake terms, as stability, the party holding the White House keeps the White House, and earthquake, the party holding the White House is tossed out of office. And we were basing this also on my theory that American presidential elections were essentially votes up or down on the strength and performance of the White House party. Of course, that was just a theory. We still had to develop a model. And of course, to develop a model, you look at past elections. And we looked at every American presidential election from 1860, the horse and buggy days of politics, when Abe Lincoln was elected, up to the most recent election, 1980, in the age of jet planes, women's suffrage, computers, polls, etc. 1980, when Ronald Reagan, another Republican, was elected. And we used the methods of pattern recognition to see what patterns in the political environment were associated with stability or earthquake. And we came up with 13 key true or false questions that could be answered prior to an upcoming election and that could account for 120 years of American politics, as I said, from the horse and buggy days when there were no computers, jet plane polls, no automobiles, women couldn't vote. My ancestors from Eastern Europe weren't here yet. Most African Americans couldn't vote, all the way up to the modern era. And these were simple, common sense questions. Things like midterm election results, sitting president, internal party battles, third parties, long and short-term economy, scandals, social unrest, foreign policy successes and failures. And only one key, or two keys rather, related to the characteristics of the two candidates, the incumbent and challenging candidates, and they were very high threshold keys. They asked whether the incumbent or challenging candidates were that once in a generation inspirational candidate like a Franklin Roosevelt or a John Kennedy or a Theodore Roosevelt or a Ronald Reagan. Very, very rare. Those were the basic 13 keys. And we had a real simple decision rule. You don't even have to take your shoes off to use the model if 6 or more of the keys were false. That is, 6 or more of the 13 were turned against the party holding the White House. They were predicted losers. 6 strikes and you're out. Fewer than 6 strikes, you don't have earthquake, you have stability. Now, this was quite a finding over 120 years of American politics, with all the fundamental changes in elections and transportation, the economy, demography, the electorate, the same set of questions could account for the results of every presidential election. Now, what do a couple of academics do when they have a big discovery like that? They did what we did. We published it in an academic journal, the United States National Academy of Sciences Journal, and we expected at least 4 or 5 people to actually read it. So Kyla Sporak goes back to Moscow. I come back as a young professor to Washington, D.C., to American University. Well, it turns out 6 people read our article, and the 6th reader was the science reporter for the Associated Press. And one morning I opened up the paper, and there is an article entitled "Odd Couple Discovers Keys to the Presidency." Well, it wasn't, the odd couple from TV, Oscar and Felix. It had to be the Soviet geophysicist and the US historian. And I suddenly realized, wow, I'm in the paper. Maybe I can go pop with this. And I send my stuff to the Washingtonian magazine. It's Washington, it's presidents, it's prediction. I think they're going to be interested in it. I sent it to the then editor-in-chief, Jack Limpert. Jack Limpert takes one look at our article, sees its math, and sends it to its most junior editor, Ken DeSalle. And I'm sitting in my office, and I get a call from DeSalle. Heavy Southern accent. He says, "Professor Lichtman, it's Ken DeSalle from the Washingtonian. I didn't understand one word of that article you wrote with the crazy Russian guy. But are you telling me that you can predict who is going to be the next president?" This is the end of 1981. Election is almost 3 years away. So I'm figuring I can give him the proper academic answer. Maybe, probabilities, caveat. And I knew if I gave him that answer, my pop career would be over in 10 seconds. So I said, "Mr. DeSalle, yes, I can." And that resulted in the first advanced prediction based on the keys in the April 1982 Washingtonian, some more than 2.5 years before the election of 1984, called "How to Bet in '84," in which I predicted Ronald Reagan's reelection. And I know what you're thinking. Oh, come on, Ronald Reagan's reelection, an easy call. Yeah, it was an easy call after the fact. But what was going on in early 1982 was the worst recession since the Great Depression. Ronald Reagan's approval ratings down in the low 40% range, about where Jimmy Carter's had been at a similar point in his presidency, and everyone was talking about a one-term president. So this prediction was not an easy one at all in April 1982. Well, someone noticed. I get a call from another Southerner, and he says, "Professor Lichtman, this is Lee Atwater calling, political director of the Ronald Reagan White House. We want you to come to the White House." And I said, "Well, I'm not sure you got the right guy. I'm friends with George McGovern." He says, No, we know who you are." I said, "Okay." So I go to the White House. And it turns out Lee Atwater, who, by the way, was Karl Rove before he was Karl Rove, a practitioner of the most dirty politics, who tragically died in his 40s and recanted all of his dirty tricks. So I'm at the White House with this political operative, Lee Atwater. Turns out he's a history buff, and he wants to know about Kennedy, Nixon, the comeback from behind victory of Harry Truman in 1948, introduces me to everyone at the White House. But he didn't bring me to the White House to schmooze about past elections or to introduce me to a guy I didn't recognize, tall, skinny guy, who turned out to be George H.W. Bush, the vice president. That's how unknown he was back then in 1982. But he didn't invite me to the White House for any of that. Lee Atwater looks me in the eye and he says, "What would happen if Ronald Reagan didn't run again?" Reasonable question. At that point, he would have been the oldest presidential candidate. I'm thinking that, no, I'm going to give it to you straight. Remember, it takes 6 keys and you're out. Right now, you're down 3 keys. But look what happens if Ronald Reagan doesn't run again. You lose the sitting president key. You have an open seat, and that's bad for the White House party. Without Reagan, you're going to have a bloody fight for the nomination. Bush and Pat Robertson and that whole crew is going to fight like crazy for the nomination. That's 2 more keys down. That's 5 keys down. And what about the incumbent candidate charisma key? Without the Gipper, forget it. You know, H.W. Bush is about as charismatic as a Passaic shopping center on a Sunday morning. So you go, Mr. Atwater, if Reagan doesn't run again, from 3 keys down and a sure win, as I predicted, to 6 keys down and a sure loss. Atwater looks me in the eye, breathes a huge sigh of relief, and says, "Thank you so much, Professor Lichtman." And of course, the rest is history. The keys played a part in history. Again, I published my first book on the keys, and since it's gone through 7 or 8 editions, in 1981. Remember, in 1981, after the success, 1991, after the successful Gulf War, George H.W. Bush's approval rating reached an all-time high of about 90%. All the big shot Democrats, Al Gore, Dick Gephardt, Ted Kennedy, Jesse Jackson, were stumbling over one another to get out of the race. Nobody wanted to face George Bush. But I get another call, a third Southerner, this time a woman. And she says, "Professor Lichtman, this is Kay Goss calling from Little Rock, Arkansas. Special Assistant to Governor Bill Clinton down here. Are you serious?" Her voice gets very deep and serious. "Are you serious that Bush can be beaten in 1992? I said, "Yes, I am." I sent Bill Clinton a memo and a copy of my book. And again, the rest is history. So you can blame me for anything you want. And by the way, I was supposed to get Bill Clinton's personal copy of my book with all his handwritten notes. He's a reader. But you may recall the transition in 2001 was a little bit rocky and chaotic, and someone stole my book. So if you see it out there, you tell them that book belongs to Professor Lichtman. You know, and how was I able to go against all of the conventional wisdom and predict a Democratic defeat in 2016? Because some of the things in terms of the keys that were extremely favorable for Democrats in 2012 had turned around in 2016. It was an open seat. There was no longer a sitting president running as there had been in 2012. And as is often typical of open seats, you had a bloody primary battle between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders that really divided the Democrats, bloodied the ultimate nominee, Hillary Clinton. You also did not have the big domestic policy success that you had in 2012 with the Affordable Care Act. There was nothing in the second Obama term to model that. And you didn't have the big splashy foreign policy triumph that you had earlier with the assassination of public enemy number 1 internationally, Osama bin Laden. So the keys had really turned from 2012 to 2016. And that was why I was able to make my against the grain prediction for a Donald Trump win. But, and by the way, at the same time I predicted Donald Trump's win in September of the election year, my Washington Post interview, I also predicted that he would be impeached. That was not based on a model, but based on my own historical understanding of Donald Trump's long history as a businessman and recent history as a politician, that his disregard for the law, his disregard for the truth, his megalomania, his self-absorption are precisely the characteristics that would lead him into impeachment. Turns out he was not only impeached once, but was the only president to be impeached 2 times. And in the second impeachment, although he didn't get the 2/3 vote to convict him. You had an unprecedented 7 members of his own party, senators, voting for conviction. Now, why did I turn around in 2020 to predict that the sitting President Trump would lose? It's an interesting explanation. As of 2019, year before the election, I had Donald Trump down 4 keys. I wasn't making a prediction yet. It was too early. Things could change, particularly in a Trump administration, but he was looking pretty good. 2 keys short of the 6 keys needed to predict his defeat. And then, of course, everything changed with the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. Now, I showed you the congratulatory letter from Donald Trump when I predicted his win in 2016. Well, he acknowledged the win, but he didn't understand the meaning of the system to the keys to the White House, which is that re-election of the party in the White House turns on performance rather than dealing substantively with the pandemic and having a electable performance. Donald Trump falsely believed that somehow he can talk his way out of it, telling everyone we have it in control, the pandemic is ending, it'll soon be over, it's nothing to worry about, a lot of nonsense that he thought he could get away with rather than dealing substantively with the pandemic. The result was the most rapid and dramatic turnaround in presidential fortunes in U.S. history. Donald Trump's failed response to the pandemic cost him 2 keys. The short-term economy key, because the ongoing pandemic tanked the short-term economy. The long-term economy key, because growth was so negative, it tanked the 4-year record. That's 6 keys, enough to count him out. And add to that another failed response, the failed response to the Black Lives Matter protest, which cost him a 7th key. It wasn't necessary to predict his defeat, the social unrest key. So Donald Trump really has no one to blame but himself for his defeat in 2020. And despite all his bluster, we know he lost fair and square. It was not a stolen election. Every single court dismissed or found incredible charges of a stolen election, including judges appointed by Trump himself, including his 3 appointed justices on the U.S. Supreme Court. His own attorney general said there was no significant fraud. His own cyber chief, who monitors these things, said it was the most fair and secure election in U.S. history. So not only did the keys predict his defeat, he lost fair and square in 2020. Now, I do not have a prediction, I'm sorry, as yet, for 2024. It's too early. Sometimes, like in 82, the keys fall into place early and I can make a prediction years ahead of time. But sometimes the situation is sufficiently fluid that you can't make a prediction years in advance, and you've got to wait and see how the keys fall into place. That was true both in 2016 and in 2020. It wasn't true for 1984. It wasn't true for 2008, where it was kind of the opposite of the situation in 1984. Things were going so badly for the second George W. Bush term that I was able to predict a Democratic victory in 2005, almost 3 years before the election actually took place. So there is no Procrustean, no given set of timing for the keys. You can't say in advance when the keys are going to fall in place. Sometimes early, sometimes not until months before the election takes place. Now, before I give you some cues about 2024, I want to share with you the ultimate secret of being a successful forecaster. It's not knowing history, although you got no history. It's not knowing politics, although you got no politics. It's not knowing math, although you got to know math. It's putting aside your own personal political preferences. If you let those preferences sneak in to your analysis, you're worthless as a forecaster. Let me tell you a little story that kind of illustrates this to the supreme level. One of my good friends is Rich Bond, former chairman of the Republican National Committee. And he was doing a fundraiser lunch in 2004 for the re-election of George W. Bush. And Rich is a big fan of the keys. And he handed out the keys, explained to them that an answer of true favors the re-election of the party holding the White House. A false is a strike against them. And he said, you know, during lunch, answer these true, false, and we'll tally them up after lunch. So lunch is completed, and Rich says to the audience, how many of you had 13 trues? And everybody raises their hands. You know, that's an extreme version, but it's not easy to keep your own political preferences out of it, because it can make you very unpopular, like it did with me in my area when I predicted Trump's win in 2016. But I have predicted about as many Democratic and Republican wins in my 10 predictions. So, you know, I've striven every year to keep politics, my own political views, whatever they may be, out of it. Now, 2024. One of the big questions surrounding the party holding the White House is, should and will President Biden run again? I'm not going to comment on Biden's health or age. I'm not a physician. I'm not a medical expert. I'm not qualified to do it, but I will just tell you as an historian, although Reagan was younger, it was a different time and age meant something different. Same arguments were being made. He's too old. He's likely to be sick. He shouldn't be running again. Same arguments we hear now against Biden, but I'm not going to enter into that. So, in my view, the Democrats' best chance to win is if Biden runs again. If Biden runs again, the Democrats secure two keys, the sitting president key and the internal party contest keys. It's not likely any Democrat's going to mount a significant campaign against Joe Biden. That means the Democrats would have to lose 6 more keys to predict their defeat. Possible, but not likely. On the other hand, if Biden doesn't run again, you obviously lose the sitting president key, and you're certainly going to lose the party contest key because there's no heir apparent to Biden. There'll be a huge fight among lots of Democrats, like we saw when they're the out party, when it doesn't matter in 2020. So while I can't give you a prediction yet, I can tell you the Democrats' best chances are for a Joe Biden run again. And so far, leaving aside the possible scandal of the classified documents, he deserves a second run. Very quietly, he has amassed the greatest set of accomplishments in domestic policy. And leaving aside whether you like them or not, I'm just talking about accomplishments, things he's gotten through since the 1960s. Just to summarize a few, the $1.9 trillion stimulus bill, the $1 billion infrastructure bill. You know, Donald Trump talked a lot about being the infrastructure president, but it was Biden who realized that. First, gun control measures, however inadequate they might be, since the 1990s. Bills to help veterans opposed to toxic burn pits. Bills to stimulate chip manufacture in the U.S. A rewrite of the obsolete Electoral Count Act that almost cost us a coup in 2020. Bill protecting interracial and gay and lesbian marriage. An enormous set of accomplishments for 2 years. It may slow down, but it's with the Republicans taking the House, but it's still quite a record. And he, under the radar, a lot of what Biden does under the radar, he's had an extraordinary accomplishment in foreign policy. It was Biden not Angela Merkel or Trudeau or anyone else who foresaw the Russian invasion, warned the Ukrainians about it, and brought together this extraordinary coalition of the West that's really saved Ukraine from Russian domination. It was Biden, not any other world leader, who achieved that. So 6 keys need to turn against the party in power if Biden runs again to predict their defeat. Only 4 if he doesn't run again. So what should you look at? Obviously, you want to look at the economy. You want to look at whether the finding of classified documents in various offices and residence of Biden will explode into a full-blown scandal. And always, you got to look at whether or not there could be some failure in foreign policy. There's an old saying attributed to the Chinese. Some call it a blessing. Some call it a curse. It is, may you live in interesting times, and we certainly live in interesting times right now. You know, while it seems far away, it isn't. The election of 2024 is one of the most important elections in American history, with American democracy very much at stake in that election. American democracy barely survived in 2020, and it's definitely going to be on the ballot in 2024. Thank you for listening. I'll take your questions now.
Yeah, Alan, before I get to the questions, you know, we didn't have the power of professorship to require pre-reading for this session. And if I could ask you to just go through, I don't know that everyone is familiar with the particulars, you know, what the keys actually say. If you could kind of run through each of the 13 keys, and then, I mean, we do have some questions of that, and maybe indicate
Sure.
which ones are already, you know, decided essentially, and which ones are open, and how you know, there's a lot of judgment, it seems to me, in
All right, let me
deciding.
get my book. Yep.
Oh, okay.
Hang on.
Okay. Yeah, for the audience, we did put a link out in the chat if you want to pull up the 13 keys, and there is also he's published a book that
Now I'm just going to give you a quick
well.
rundown on the keys, but
Sure,
you got
okay.
to really understand it. You got to get my book, Predicting the Next President, The Keys to the White House 2020, because I can't in 2 minutes fully explicate the keys, but here they are. Key 1, and these are all phrased in a way that an answer of true favors the reelection of the White House party, an answer of false favors the challenger. Key 1, incumbent party mandate based upon midterm elections. That's already lost to the Democrats. Key 2, nomination contest. That depends upon, as I explained, whether Biden runs again. Key 3, incumbency, also turns on whether Biden runs again. Key 4, third party. Doesn't look like there's going to be a major third party. Keys 5 and 6 are the short-term and long-term economy, and we don't know the answer to that yet. It's going to depend upon what happens in the next couple of years. Key 7, policy change. That's already locked in for the White House party. All of those policy changes that I mentioned, plus all the executive orders overturning a lot of the things Trump has done. Social unrest, so far that looks positive for the White House party. Scandal remains to be seen whether the classified documents imbroglio boils over into a major scandal, or like the Iran-Contra scandal kind of fades away by election day. Foreign or military failure, nothing approaching that. Yeah, I know the optics were bad for the Afghanistan withdrawal, but it was actually one of the more successful withdrawals despite the bad obstacles, and it's pretty much forgotten. Foreign military success, yes. Ukraine, unless that turns negative, these things can change. Incumbent charisma, no. Neither Biden nor, frankly, any other likely Democrat is John F. Kennedy. Challenger charisma, no. Donald Trump appeals to a narrow base, but is not broadly appealing like the charismatic candidates, and neither is any other likely Republican nominee. So those are the 13 keys, and that's what you should be looking for. Now, you mentioned judgment. You know, when I first came up with the keys in 1981, all the professional forecasters blasted me. I had committed the sin of subjectivity because some of the keys are not cut and dried, and they do need some judgment. But I kept explaining, it's not random judgment. First of all, I've answered these questions all the way back to 1860. So the next answer has got to be consistent. You have this incredible record on which to base your answer. And two, when you buy my book, you'll see I explain in great detail how to narrow down the answers to these keys. And finally, I say, historians engage in judgment all the time. This is the real world. You can't reduce the real world to black and white. Well, took about 15 years. And finally, the professional forecasting community came around and realized that a system like mine, which included both judgmental and kind of cut and dried indicators, was the most successful kind of system. I twice was the keynoter for the International Forecasting Summit. I published in all the major forecasting journals, and I presented at the highest level of political science, the Conference of the American Political Science Association.
No, I appreciate that rundown. And actually with that as a background, now that people kind of have a sense of the nature of these 13 keys, we do have a lot of questions about the timing of your prediction. I mean, you did note, in some cases it was the keys were, I guess, enough locked in stone you could do early. And also others you've had to wait. Obviously, the economy is two keys. The scandal is obviously one that has to be waited on. But so what, just if you could further elaborate on the timing on when do you feel comfortable kind of saying, okay, enough is solidified, because events can change. And also someone asked about, what about last minute? I mean, there's a lot now where people try to come out with last minute news to sway the electorate. And is that at all, which is probably new? I mean, is that something you may need to adjust? Because history hasn't always had that kind of aspect. So there's a lot there, but if you could,
I can answer that.
Yeah.
First of all, as I explained, there's no set time that the keys fall into place. Sometimes an administration like that of Reagan is sufficiently successful that you can make a prediction early. Sometimes an administration is sufficiently unsuccessful, like the second Bush term, that you can make a prediction early. But sometimes, as in 2016 and 2020, the keys only fall into place during the election year itself. Now, I know what you're referring to, this kind of late break, the October surprise. No October surprise has ever changed a prediction or changed the outcome of an election. I know people say, oh, you got to adjust for that. And the answer is no. My system has worked for 160 years. I also get every year a similar thing. Well, things are different this year. We have an African-American running. Never had an African-American run. We have a woman running. Never had a woman run. We have a guy who's 80 years old, maybe running. Never had that before. We have social media. We never had that before. And my answer is, if I, on the fly, ad hoc, tried to adjust the keys to the vagaries of an individual election, I'd be like the pundits. But I stick to my system because mathematically, this is my bow to the late Volodya Kyla-Sporok, it is what we call a robust system. It has survived since 1860 through enormous changes in our economy, in our demography, in the way elections are conducted, in the composition of the electorate itself. So given that it's so robust and has weathered much bigger changes than a woman running or social media or an African-American running, I do not make on-the-fly ad hoc changes. That's the path to error.
Okay, thanks. And actually, there's a very specific question talking about, do you have to wait till after the primaries? I mean, clearly two of the keys relate to the person that's running. There's also a third party key. I mean, so I know you have come out with your conclusion prior to the primaries being concluded. So maybe you can illuminate how it is, given that there's, I think, 3 keys. That,
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes, like for 84, assuming Reagan was running, I predicted that there wouldn't be a primary contest. Just like if Biden runs in 2020, I'm predicting there wouldn't be a primary contest. And moreover, as I said, to turn those keys, you got to be a once in a generation inspirational candidate. We know Biden does not fit that bill, and we know no putative Republican candidate fits that bill either. So I don't have to wait until the primaries are conducted to decide those keys.
Okay. And here's a question. It said, Sonia's indicated you predicted Trump would not run for the 2024 presidential election. But he did. Right? Maybe they mean
2024. I get it.
Yeah.
No, he says he's running, but doesn't mean he's going to be the candidate. I mean, I can't predict what someone might say. But my point was, I think Trump has so many legal problems, both criminal and civil, that his legal, he may want to run, but that's kind of irrelevant, that his civil and criminal liabilities are so great that they're going to prevent him from being the Republican candidate. Obviously, I didn't mean that he couldn't say he wanted to run. What I meant was I did not believe that he was going to be the Republican candidate. By the way, I did a CNN commentary on this. You know, whatever happens to Trump, it's still the Trump party. The party in recent years has abandoned everything that conservative Republicans once claimed to stand for. Personal responsibility, personal morality, a joke. Not only Donald Trump, but look at George Santos, who, you know, is sitting in Congress and defended by the Speaker of the House, McCarthy. Personal responsibility, personal morality, gone. Fiscal responsibility, gone. Donald Trump was one of the biggest deficit builders in our history. States' rights, forget it. They want to have a national abortion ban. Limited government, out the window. A national abortion ban would be the biggest intrusion on the American people, perhaps in the history of the country. Respect for traditional institutions. How many Republicans voted to disallow results of the 2020 election? So even if it's not Trump, it's still a party that is no longer moored to basic Republican principles. And, you know, some older Republicans like Bill Kristol and George Will have recognized this, Steve Schmidt and many others. And don't expect, if it's Ron DeSantis, anything is going to change. You know, he doesn't have Trump's kind of pizzazz. He's, you know, pretty much of a drag as a individual, but he stands for all the same things.
Yeah, I think I read that wrong. It says you predicted, the question was, you predicted Trump would not run for in 2024. I think you clarified that in your answer. So that's obviously just your assessment outside of the model.
Right. It's nothing to do with the model. Model doesn't predict who's going to run.
Right. But a related question is, if Trump is the nominee or runs, I suppose, as a third party, does that affect the incumbency key and what the result is on that key? Because he was an ex-president, right?
If he was running, he'd be the challenger, whether he was an ex-president or not. Grover Cleveland, an ex-president, ran and was still the challenging candidate. So it would not affect the incumbent party keys at all.
Right. So Grover Cleveland, obviously, when you did the testing of this, so it did come out with Grover Cleveland winning the second election.
Election. Yeah. Actually, his third election.
Third election. Yeah. Actually,
84, 88, 92.
Right. So it did predict that.
And yeah, he counted.
Well, I mean, it validated that, I should say.
Yeah, I didn't predict. As old as I am, I didn't know Grover Cleveland.
Yeah. And another one, I guess, on the Trump theme, we'll try to get these out of the way. But why doesn't the 14th Amendment disallow him to run for office again?
Well, he hasn't been convicted of anything. It might, if he's convicted of crimes against the United States, sedition. It's possible that the 14th Amendment could bar him, but you know, that would be such a prolonged legal battle. It might not even be over until the presidential election was over. But I think if he is actually convicted of a crime, he's not going to be the nominee anyway, so that won't matter.
Yeah. Okay. Now, are some keys more important than others in determining the outcome?
That's a great question. And I get that often. They say to me, Professor Lichtman, in 1932, during the Great Depression, how can the economy only count for 2 keys? That can't be right. Or in 1968, how can the war in Vietnam only account for 2 keys? That can't possibly be right. And the answer is twofold. One, if you start weighting keys, you're going to make errors because there's no way to know in advance which keys should weight more than others. That's the fallacy of traditional prediction systems, which are based on equations with weights. They're called parameters, which you have to set before the election, but they're going to change unpredictably. So how does the keys adjust for this? It's what's called trigger effects. We don't have to make errors by trying to weight the keys in advance. If one or more keys are significant enough, they're going to trigger other keys. So the Great Depression triggered midterm losses for the Republicans, another key. It triggered social unrest, another key. It triggered a charismatic candidate, Franklin Roosevelt, to run in 1932 when he earlier had no plans to do so. The war in Vietnam triggered social unrest, triggered midterm losses for the incumbent Democrats, triggered, that's 2, triggered the incumbent President Lyndon Johnson not to run again, that's 3, triggered major internal party contest, that's 4. So the keys are self-adjusting. I don't have to try to weight them in advance of an election.
Yeah, and kind of related, and I think you've answered this, are there 1 or 2 keys that tend to tip the balance and make the difference? And it sounds like some are related, as you've just described. And so those, it seemed, can't, like with the economy, for example, can be in combination with each other, very influential.
It can be a trigger, absolutely. You know, 1 key can trigger, and that's the point. That's why the system is self-adjusting. That's why each key is equally weighted. For those who are more mathematically inclined, I have 2 vectors. One vector is 0 and 1 for stability and upheaval. The other vector is 0 and 1 for each of the 13 keys.
Okay, thanks for going over that. Now, there's quite a few questions on the Electoral College versus the popular vote. I mean, you know, is that something you factored into when you created the model? Are you predicting, you know, what if they're not in sync, so on and so forth? So I think you've gotten a lot of questions from over the last couple cycles on this. So I assume you have a good kind of discussion on that.
You know, I wasn't worried about that until after 2000, because before 2000, you had to go back to 1888 for the popular vote and the Electoral College vote to diverge. But since 2000, I've only been focused on who's going to win essentially the Electoral College result. Why? Because the popular vote is no longer an accurate barometer of who's going to win. The Republicans from 1992 to 2020, almost 30 years, have won the popular vote once in 2004. Yet they've won the presidency 3 times, 2000, 2004. And I'm talking about the initial. I know Bush won a second term. And 2000, 2004, and 2016. 3 times they've won the presidency. Only once in nearly 30 years won the popular vote. Why? The answer is 2 states. In 2 states, New York and California, the Democrats pile up a popular vote margin in presidential elections of about 5 to 6 million popular votes. What does that count for in the Electoral College? 0. They could win New York and California by 1 vote and still get the same number of Electoral College votes. Whereas there's nothing comparable on the Republican side. The biggest popular vote margin for Republicans is about 900,000 in the state of Texas. That's why I only call winners now and do not call the popular vote, because it's no longer. This is one of the biggest sea changes in American political history that's not been commented on enough. It's not only a change for the keys, it's a fundamental challenge to American democracy. And in fact, the polls show a majority of Americans favor getting rid of the Electoral College and going to a popular vote. You know, we're the world's longest continuously running democracy. And that's a great thing. We have this great democratic tradition, but it also means we're stuck with some obsolete 18th century institutions, foremost of which is the Electoral College, which was very much tied to slavery. Because if you had an outright popular vote, the slaves would count for 0. And the southern states wouldn't stand for that. So you had the notorious 3/5 compromise, where for purposes of congressional representation and representation in the Electoral College, slaves would count for 3/5 of a vote. The problem is, though, essentially you need a constitutional amendment to change the system, and that's not going to happen. You're not going to get 2/3 of both houses and 3/4 of the states moving to popular voting.
So, I mean, a question, I think you would agree with the premise of this question, you know, has the Electoral College outlived its usefulness? It sounds like your opinion would be yes on that, but
yeah, check out my book, 13 Cracks, Repairing American Democracy After Trump. 2 of the reforms that I cite in 13 Cracks to strengthen our democracy is to get rid of the Electoral College and modify the Senate. It makes no sense that, you know, Wyoming with what, less than 1 million people has 2 senators, and California, you know, with tens of millions of people has 2. I'm not saying you should turn the Senate into the House, but I have a proposal in 13 Cracks for having kind of a sliding scale Senate, where every state would get at least 1 and the largest state would get about 10.
That seems much more logical than our current system, for sure.
And again, it's an 18th century institution. Why did they do that? Because they had to have the small states ratify the Constitution. Plus, back in those days, the discrepancy between the smallest states and the largest states, you know, was about 5 or 6 to 1. Today, it's like 65 to 1.
Yeah. So going back to your keys, so, you know, some of them are pretty clear cut, even mathematical, but the ones that require some analysis, what's the most difficult one for you to analyze and decide on?
That's a good question. I haven't really thought about that. Let me take a look. It's not charisma. That's usually pretty easy. And the answer is almost always no. None of the candidates are charismatic. It might be foreign policy successes and failures, because to either score a success or score a failure, it can't just be the response to the moment, like what we saw with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. You got to look at it more long term, look at it both in terms of the significance for foreign policy and the public response.
Okay, thanks for that explanation. That was great. And so have you created a model to predict elections in other countries, or U.S. Senate elections, governor election, or even the primaries?
I've tried governors. I've tried senators. The problem is very difficult to have one model, one set of keys for, you know, 50 gubernatorial and 100 senatorial elections. I actually did publish a model for the Senate, and I got about 85% right, which I thought was pretty damn good for, you know, one set of keys. And they were very different than the presidential keys. But as you can imagine, what did everyone focus on? The elections that I missed. So I decided, I didn't want to tarnish my presidential results and have stopped doing that. Far as foreign countries are concerned, absolutely, the model is applicable, but I'm not the one to do it because I don't know enough about the history and politics. But I will tell you a story. Many years ago, I get a call from this very nice woman who says, we're very interested in applying your model to foreign elections, and we'd like you to come talk to our group. And I said, fine, I'm happy to do it. Where is your group located? Langley, Virginia. It was the CIA. And I gave a talk to, I don't know, 30 CIA agents about how you can apply the model to foreign elections. I didn't actually do it, but I just outlined the procedure. Never heard from them again. So for all I know, the CIA has 150 Lichtman models for elections all over the world, or none. Probably never know in my lifetime.
Okay, so here's an interesting one, and I was curious about this myself. So if Trump runs as a third party, and technically you read your model, that would make that key false and work against Biden. So, but is that how it would work in this case, or do you make an exception? Because it seems like that would be very helpful.
Yeah, I do talk about this in my book, and it's just about, I'm not sure it's ever happened. You don't usually get a model like that. And I don't think Trump, if he doesn't get the nomination, will run as a third party. But I do talk about making an exception when it's clearly a split within the opposition party. And clearly a Trump run would be a split within the opposition party.
Okay, thanks for that clarification.
That's in the book. Okay,
yeah, it sounds like there's a lot in the book. People maybe should look that up, definitely.
Yeah. I can only tell you so much, in an hour and a half.
Right, and we are getting close to our 4:15 cutoff, so let me see if I can, we may not get to all the questions. Let me try to choose and pick. So what does the vice presidential candidate have an impact? It's not in your model, and I guess maybe when you ran it, ran back the history, it just never seemed to impact it. Is that accurate?
Zero impact of the vice presidential candidate, which has a lesson for presidential candidates, which is don't worry about the political implications of your vice presidential pick. Pick someone who you're compatible with and you'd feel comfortable if they took over the presidency. I'll tell you another little historical story. When William McKinley ran for re-election in 1900, his vice president, Garrett Hobart, had died. So they had to pick a new vice president. And the political bosses in New York State said, pick Theodore Roosevelt. He's a pain in our behind, He's this independent, progressive guy. We want to get rid of him. Let's put him in the most useless office possible, the vice presidency. And McKinley's campaign manager objected. He said, yeah, it may be the most useless office in the world, but do you really want that damn cowboy one heartbeat away from the presidency? And of course, we know at the very beginning of his term, McKinley was assassinated and the damn cowboy became president.
Yeah, interesting how history can unfold. But yeah, in fact, here's a couple of what ifs, alternate history, I suppose, and
which I never answer, but I'll listen.
Well, no, it's what your model would have done. So if Bernie Sanders had defeated Hillary and been the nominee, how would that have changed the keys?
Zero. Still would have been the incumbent party nominee. All the incumbent party keys would have been the same, including the party contest. So the identity of Hillary Clinton versus Bernie Sanders, given that none of them was a Franklin Roosevelt, would have had zero impact on the keys.
Okay. Thanks for that clarification. One more like that. So a lot of the pundits thought that the Iran hostage scandal, I guess you can call it, sunk Carter's re-election chances. Did you factor that in, your prediction?
Absolutely.
And was that determinative, or so if it hadn't happened, would he have won re-election? Or do you recall?
No, there were more than 6 keys out against him. So even if that key hadn't turned, I still the keys would have still obviously retrodicted. I didn't predict 1980, but they still would have called for his defeat. There were enough negatives out against Jimmy Carter.
Okay. And here's one, I guess you can take it whatever direction you want. But if the election is stolen, you know, I mean, are your keys in any way? I mean, yeah. What in the case of a stolen election? How define that however you want, I guess.
You know, I'm only human. Nobody can adjust for a stolen election, since you won't know until after it happened. But we do know 2020 was not stolen. The keys correctly called a legitimate election for Joe Biden. And, you know, it's not so easy to steal an election.
Okay. Did you want to talk at all about the Bush-Gore election? You can take a pass if you want.
If there were any stolen election, that was it.
Yeah. Okay.
Because the Supreme Court stopped the count with Bush ahead by 537 votes. And Bush won by 1 electoral college vote. Nothing like 2020, when, you know, states with tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of votes would have to turn. But 537 votes, that's the error margin. And I did a report for the United States Commission on Civil Rights, the premier commission dealing with civil rights. And my report, which you can find still there on the United States Commission on Civil Rights website, found that 1 out of every 9 to 10 African Americans who had cast a ballot had their ballot discarded, primarily because they punched in Al Gore and then wrote in Al Gore just to be sure. And that created what's called an overvote, which invalidated your ballot. That compared to 1 out of 50 ballots cast by whites that were discarded. So if the ratio of black to white discarded ballots was just the same, over 40,000 more black votes would have counted, 95% for Gore, and Gore would have won going away.
Well, it kind of raises a question when the election is that close. I mean, does your model literally, in some cases, on the fence? I mean, I know it's either goes one way or another.
That was the closest call.
Was very close.
Yeah, that was the closest call, was 2000. And yes, close elections, the model is often 6 keys, not like 2008 with like 10 keys out against, or 2000, or the opposite, 1984, where there were only 3. But I've got to stick with the model. Once you go out, this is another thing you got to understand if you're going to be a forecaster. You can't second guess your model. Then you're going to make serious errors. If I had second guessed my model in 2016 and gone with the 99% verdict of the pollsters and the pundits, I would have made an error. So, you know, I've been doing this for 40 years. And every 4 years, because I make a call, I'm not a, someone like Nate Silver who says, well, it's an 80% chance Hillary Clinton would win. And then when she loses, he says, still, I told you there's a 20% chance she would lose. That's a lot of nonsense. Those are not real probabilities. I actually make a call. So every 4 years now, for 40 years, 10 times, I've been out on a limb making an actual call. And I know if I'm wrong, every critic is going to be all over me. So, surprised I've lived to be 75 with all the anxiety every 4 years.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of pressure there. Right. Yeah. So actually someone wanted you to clarify in terms of where things currently stand, on the foreign policy success key, I guess, is that which way is that for Biden currently?
It's leaning for Biden, but the Ukrainian situation is not fully played out.
Okay. And several people want to know whatever happened to your Russian colleague.
Well, he was about 30 years older than me, and about 5 to 10 years ago, he sadly passed away. But we had kept in touch right up to his death.
Oh, okay, great. And did he go on to do any other models?
He did. Not
Oh.
with me, but he modeled revolutions. He modeled recessions. It's kind of the theory that we were using, this pattern recognition, is the theory of everything. Most models are based on a micro analysis, analyze all the various voter groups. Ours is a macro analysis. We boil down a very complicated social system, like a presidential election, into a few 13 simple integral parameters. I like to use the analogy of sugar in a hot cup of tea. If you tried to follow all the individual molecules, you get nowhere, too complicated. But you can, reduce it down to things like temperature and sweetness, and with simple integral parameters, get a pretty good idea of what's going on with the complex movement of the sugar molecules in the cup of tea. So in principle, you could apply this methodology to anything. I get calls all the time, people saying, can't we do this for horse racing or sports betting? And I always turn it down because I don't want to wind up with cement overshoes, in the bay.
Yeah, good call on that. And
I'll take one more question.
Yeah, one more question. This is going to be the last question. And so this is how confident are you in the model? Obviously, it's worked very well. I mean, is there any thought of a need to adjust it, or are you perfectly comfortable it's going to continue to work for some time going forward?
I'm not psychic Gene Dixon. I don't have a crystal ball that I look into. I don't have a pipeline to up above. My model is based on history. And as I said, it's a very robust model because it's based retrospectively and prospectively on 160 years of history and enormous changes. So I don't adjust the model on the fly. That's another thing you shouldn't ever do as a forecaster. That creates errors. Does that mean that my model will last forever? I can't promise that. Maybe there'll be such a huge sea change, like a successful coup, that will totally alter the basis of American democracy. But bearing something like that, I have a lot of confidence in the robustness of the model. The other thing about the model, for 30 years, every 4 years, I've been writing articles for a magazine called Social Education. It's the magazine for high school students. Now, why do they want to hear about the keys? Because the keys are historically based. As I said, to answer the questions, you got to recreate American history. All right, what were foreign policy successes in the past? And how do they compare to what's going on today? What policy changes did Lyndon Johnson or Ronald Reagan or Franklin Roosevelt institute? And how do they compare to what Joe Biden is doing today? So in essence, it's a great teaching tool because you've got to kind of redo, recreate, redebate American history. And the fact that it is judgmental and not something cut and dry, I think is a strength because we can debate it. We can discuss it, and we can learn a lot from our debates and discussion. And I hope all of you have learned at least a little something from our talk today. I thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Lichtman. It's very illuminating. And if anyone wants to go further in depth on this, again, Professor Lichtman has written a book on this. You might want to look into reading that. So, and thanks for all your questions. We got to most of them. So again, I know you have to run, Professor Lichtman, but thank you so much for coming on and explaining this to us.
Bye-bye.